Good morning. We'll start now. We're middle of chapter 7. We're on page Pei Gimel, which is the equivalent of page 165 in the Tanya. And we're discussing here some very fundamental, foundational ideas of the understanding of Hashem, the understanding of God and his relationship to the world. And it's absolutely fascinating and hopefully also very enjoyable to discover and discuss today's topic. So the last thing we discussed last week was the concept, which is phenomenal by the Rambam, and that is that Hashem is unique in his wisdom, that unlike a human being, which is a composite of wisdom and an individual, and not just the wisdom of the individual, but the power to think. So we have the person, the power to think, the intellectual process, and the thing that you think about. And all those, as we mentioned, become one. Those three things, through a person's experiences in life, they start off as an infant, and they experience knowledge and life and occurrences and all different information that their mind gathers. This becomes one identity. You can't separate the person, who he becomes, who she becomes, from all the knowledge that they have gained. Nevertheless, the truth is, it's a composite of experiences. If a person would forget some things they learned in school, or some knowledge they gained in a book or something else, it wouldn't change their identity. They still remain a person. By Hashem, and also it started off as two separate things that became one. There was the information, the knowledge, the wisdom, the philosophy, the mathematics, the science, the Torah, and they become one with the person. True, it's an absolute oneness, as we explained. Your knowledge and you becomes absolutely one. The method we get, some of the examples we gave was baking challah. While you start off with many ingredients, the final product you don't point to and say, "Hey, here's the flour, here's the water, here's the eggs." It all becomes one challah at the end. The same thing is true if you want to even go a better example, is when you merge two different trees to produce a nectarine or a tangerine or one of these hybrid products of fruit, which are delicious. The reality is you cannot point to a part of the fruit and say, this is the apple, this is the peach. It becomes one. It becomes one identity. There are characteristics that we see from each one, but it becomes one. Nevertheless, it started off as two. By Hashem, it's not so. Hashem's knowledge, Hashem's wisdom, and the things that Hashem knows is not three separate things that become one. It's all one. You cannot separate it. And we said this is something that a mind can't grasp, the ears can't hear, the mouth can't say. It's something physically, humanly, or any created being can't explain it. It's a concept that we can't grasp. Nevertheless, the knowledge of this truth gives us a beautiful insight into everything we're discussing. Why? And this is for me, this is a very fascinating point of the whole understanding of God. And what comes out here is we have two opposite truths at the same exact time. What are these two opposite truths? On one hand, it says God, Hashem, is aware of every single thing in creation. And not just aware of it, he's one with it. To the angels, to the human beings, to a mosquito, to a blade of grass, to a little worm somewhere in a pond, in an ocean. All of those things Hashem is aware of intimately of its existence. Now think about, by the way, the concept of such a supercomputer. Think about a teacher in a classroom. Has to keep track and know and think about every kid, if they're paying attention, if they're listening, if they're behaving, if they have, anxiety, how to communicate with each of the students. That's one teacher with a classroom of, let's say, 20 students. Now imagine if the teacher also not only had to keep track of each of the students, but also their blood pressure, the molecular level of the child, their chemistry level, every detail of the child. And now not just that, but the entire school, every classroom, and then every kid in the world, and every human being in the world, and every planet, and every created being, Hashem's knowledge down to every worm, every bug, every ant, every creature. Hashem knows exactly, meaning that thing is a real entity that Hashem knows about. There really is a worm, and there really is a planet, and there really is a flower, and there really is a blade of grass, and there really is a house, etc. Hashem is aware of it, and it's there at the same exact time, because Hashem's knowledge, Hashem's awareness, and Hashem's information that he knows, which is, in this case, about these creatures, a bug, a person, a tree, a fly, a worm, are all one with Hashem. It's not something separate. That means they have no existence outside of God, which means nothing else exists outside of God. So at the same exact time, we have two absolute truths. One truth is that Hashem is aware of every single creature and every single being. So we are there, we exist. There's a fly, there's a worm, there's a person. At the same exact time, they have no independent existence. There's no separate identity of any planet, existence, creation, angel outside of Hashem. That means from before Hashem created the world and after Hashem created, before Hashem was only God, and now it's only God. Because every single thing that we see is absolute godliness. We just see it in our perspective, but absolutely exist in 1,000%. And Hashem is aware of us. At the same exact time, we don't have an independent existence outside of God. It's a phenomenal idea of these two things coming together. That's what we were saying last week. Again, I want to make sure the connection is clear, because to me it's a little choppy, but again, it's the Wi-Fi I have where I'm working. We're going to go inside now. I'm reading all this inside. We're going to read this section of chapter 7. Actually going to begin from the bottom of page 164. On the bottom of 164, we're going to go from 4 lines from the bottom, the third to last word. And we're going to go over, this is all a quote from the Rambam. The Rambam is describing, and it's the laws of Teshuvah, he's describing there the essence of Hashem's existence as one, his knowledge, Hashem's wisdom, and the thing he knows about is all one. Let's see it inside here. The Ein Daitei Davar Noisav Al Mahusei V'Atzmusai. By Hashem, his knowledge, his wisdom is not something outside of himself. It's not like we have 2 + 2 = 4, and then we have our existence. Thank you, Adeb. We have our existence as a person. At the same time, 2 + 2 = 4. So there's us and the information that we know, and there's a part of us that thinks. By Hashem, it's all one. There's only one existence, God. And he is one with his Yadeya, Yadua, and the Mada. What he knows, how he thinks, and the thing he knows about, and himself. Unlike how it is by a person, by a human being, by a person, our knowledge is something separate from ourselves. True, it becomes one with us over our time, our existence, our experiences. It changes us. It changes, somebody they say who was mugged has a different perspective on how to treat muggers. Somebody who, God forbid, saw somebody get sick from lung cancer has a different perspective on smoking. But the knowledge is still information that you gained, that you learned. It's not you. It affects you. It changes you. It becomes part of you. But it started off as like the ingredients of a cake or a challah that all became one. The person becomes one with it. He's actually a hybrid. Hybrid's not the right word. He's actually a merge. Like we say, you take the peach and the apple and you make a nectarine. The nectarine now doesn't have separate parts that are apples or parts that are peach or whatever their fruits are. It is one new identity. But to start, it's 2 separate things that make the person. And if somehow the knowledge would leave the person, if you forget something that he learned in high school, you're still a person and you're still a mensch, and you still can be a parent and a husband and a wife and a child, even though you forgot information, because your knowledge and you are not the same thing. It's 2 separate things that have become one as long as you know it. Because when a person studies and learns something, by top of next page, he already had a thinking soul. If you remember in Tanya, in the very beginning, we spoke about the animal soul and the godly soul. And we did speak that the animal soul has 3 components to it. The animal soul, we said, had a vital soul, a natural soul, and an animal soul. That's okay, 3 components. But you still have the animal soul with its 3 components, and you have the godly soul. But the truth is, we mentioned a number of times, is really the 3rd soul. And that's a soul that the Alter Rebbe, the author of Tanya, is talking to when he writes the Tanya. Who is he talking to? He's not talking to the godly soul. He's not talking to the animal soul. He's talking to the 3rd soul we have. That's called the thinking soul. Nefesh HaMaskelis. This is one of the few times in Tanya where it's referenced to. The Nefesh HaMaskelis, the thinking soul, is us, me. My thinking soul, and that's the one that chooses to do right to do what's good, to do what's not so good. The thinking soul chooses to listen to the animal soul or to listen to the godly soul. But that thinking soul existed before the thought came in and the knowledge came into the mind, the heart, the soul of the thinking soul, and exists afterwards. It's independent. So you have nafshe hamaskeles, this thing that he knows existed before you discovered it and learned it, and exists afterwards. And the person, the thinking soul, existed before. Even before you knew that 25 times 25 equals, I don't even know what it equals. 5 times 5 is 25. Even before you learned this information, you had a thinking soul. And true, after you learned it, this knowledge became part of your soul, part of your identity. And yes, every single day you learn more information. Every single day you gain more knowledge. And every single day the experiences, things that you learned, you read, you hear in conversations or classes or on the radio, things that you pick up and your knowledge that you gain becomes part of you, which is why, by the way, it's important to make sure that what you pick up is healthy, wholesome information because it becomes part of us. Nevertheless, it's still not called a true unity. True unity is when we're actually one in its essence, whereas human beings is nothing that's one in its essence. Our bodies, our flesh and blood, we take all different foods that we eat. We eat vegetables, we eat fruit, we eat proteins and carbs, and all that becomes us. Our identity, 200 pounds or 170 pounds, whatever we are, all that weight, all that existence that we have is a composite of everything we ate, but it was something else that became part of us. I can't point to where in my arm is all the chicken and carrots that I had, but that's what I am. That's what I am, a collection of it. So while in my essence it becomes truly unified on one, my hand, you don't see all the fruits and vegetables that I ate. You saw that how it became my flesh and blood. Nevertheless, it is. When I was born, I was 6 pounds or 7 pounds or 8 pounds. And today I weigh 180 pounds. Sounds good. Bottom line is, all of that becomes one, but it becomes one, which means it wasn't intrinsically or in essence one. It's a composite. It's a merge of many things becoming one, like ingredients. But Hashem, we want to explain the depth of this point, how Hashem is knowledge, his wisdom, and that who Hashem is in essence is all one. 4 lines from the top. Hu achdus pashut b'li harkava. He is an absolute oneness without any merging. There is no, God forbid, like other religions, they try and have a composite of what a God is. That's not a God we believe in. A God we believe in is the absolute oneness in its essence and its source and its own in its existence. B'li shum harkava v'tzad ribui klal, with nothing merging or making this essence into what it is. And therefore, Hashem and everything that he knows and Hashem's knowing itself is all one. B'li shum harkava, and it's something which has no merging. Hashem is absolutely one. And now we know this concept tells us these two brilliant things. Therefore, all of the world is Hashem's knowledge. Hashem knows of us. Hashem knows every existence. And at the same time, meaning Hashem knows of us, and therefore we exist. Actually, Hashem knows of us, but Hashem's knowledge is one with him. It's not an outside existence. It doesn't change Hashem. The existence of us doesn't change God at all, God forbid, because it's all part of God's knowledge, which is one with him. And therefore, and here's a phenomenal idea which the Rambam uses to answer. Well, I'll first say the point, then I'll tell you a phenomenal idea he tells us. Just like it's impossible, and this is very important, it's impossible for a human being, or any angel for that matter, to truly understand God. We can't understand God. He is off the radar, out of our pay grade, out of our ability to comprehend. We can't understand God. Same thing, we can't understand his knowledge, but to believe in faith. We have to have faith that Hashem's knowledge is something out of our ability to understand. We can't understand, not much, I shouldn't say similar to, but example in my mind would be trying to explain to a blind person, and this may not be a good example, but this is the example that I have in my head. So if it's not correct, I apologize. Trying to explain to a blind person the difference between red and maroon, or red and burgundy. A blind person doesn't know what red is, doesn't know what burgundy is, doesn't understand what you mean when you say, and if you think you can successfully explain it to him, then now I picture, or blue and yellow. Now I can picture. He can't. Why? He's never seen a color in his life, and therefore colors don't begin to have anything in a spectrum. He has no way to compare it or understand it or analyze it, or to sort of put it into place, because he's never seen anything in his life. He's blind from birth. We can't understand God. We can't understand his process of thinking and how it thinks and what God's thinking means. We could use it in metaphors. We could explain ideas. The Rambam uses this. One of the famous questions that almost everyone asks when we start learning Hasidic philosophy or start understanding a philosophy of Judaism is the number one question. If Hashem knows the future and Hashem knows what's going to happen, how do we have free choice? Free choice means that I can do what I want, but I can't do what I want because Hashem already knows what I'm going to do, and therefore whatever I'm going to do is already determined. It's already determined what choice I'm going to make. The Rambam's answer is fascinating. You're thinking of God's wisdom and knowledge like human beings' wisdom and knowledge. And this is the words he uses. You have to have faith that Hashem's knowledge works differently. You don't have we can't fathom, we can't understand what does it mean Hashem's knowledge. We can't understand what it means Hashem knows. And therefore to say Hashem knows affects our behavior is a foolish statement. It's like a blind person saying, you know what the problem is? That the color yellow is too similar to the color blue. You don't know what yellow, you don't know what blue is. What do you mean it's similar? Say that Hashem's knowledge of the future affects our choices. We're applying and projecting human knowledge on God, which is a foolish thing to do, and God's knowledge is a completely different knowledge. That's how he answers this question over there in the Hilchos Tshuva. The Raavad, of course, who very often or frequently challenges and questions the Rambam, he says the Rambam is answering a logical question with an answer of faith. You think when he's going to answer the question, he's going to answer it like, okay, so here's let me explain, let me prove it to you. But he doesn't do that. The Rambam goes and says, accept it as faith that God's knowledge is different. He said, better off don't ask the question. But again, it's not so to it in the later chapters. But it's a fascinating discussion. But the bottom line is, Hashem's knowledge in our minds, we project a certain view. It's not at all we project what we think. Why? Because we could only picture knowledge based on human knowledge or even computer knowledge, data, artificial intelligence, but we can't understand knowledge of God. And therefore, whatever metaphor, whatever example, whatever picture we're going to have is going to be wrong. So therefore, he says, just so you know, with faith, accept the fact that God's knowledge is different. We can't understand it. It's not in our spectrum. Okay. Going back inside here, we have to only have faith that Hashem and his wisdom are all one. And this gives us a tremendous insight into these two things we had a question the last couple of chapters. How do we come to reconcile that we exist and we don't exist? And the answer is, if you understand that we can't understand God's wisdom, but his wisdom is one with him, we understand that Hashem is aware of us. He knows of us. He knows what the worm in the ocean is feeling. But at the same time, that knowledge is within one with God. So therefore, it doesn't have an identity separate from himself. 2 + 2 = 4 by God is not a separate existence. That's essence of God. And with this knowledge of himself, this knowledge that is God's essence, again, a concept we can't grasp. Makir v'yedea, he knows and he recognizes kol hanimtsoyim elyonim v'tachtonim. Hashem knows and is aware of every existence because we do exist. And Hashem knows about all the angels and all the planets and all the squirrels and all the chipmunks and all the mice and all the zebras. He knows everything. Ad shilshul cotton shebiyam, till the tiniest worm. Oh, shilshul is a type of worm that has like little shapes, like a squiggly worm from the ocean. Hashem knows about that worm. Vad yitish cotton sheyiye betabur adits, to the smallest gnat, to the smallest bug, to the smallest mosquito that's found in the belly of the earth. That means if you dig down and you're going to find tiny insects in the ground, each and every individual what Hashem knows about. We just know, there's something called the cicadas. I forgot what these crickets are called. The ones that dig, dig in the ground. There's all different bugs in the ground. We know of the concept that there are a lot of bugs in the ground, insects. Hashem knows each one individually, much more than we know our children, or we know, because Hashem's knowledge of each one is unbelievably intimate and self. The same way you're aware of your finger, Hashem is aware of every single bug, and there's a lot of them, and every single insect, every single fish, etc., etc. Ein dover nelim menu. There's nothing hidden from God. There's no bug He's not aware of. There's no flies, no blade of grass. Every blade of grass, every weed, every dandelion, every flower, Hashem is aware of and knows and is in tune with it. Its needs. And when a little worm is hot in the sun, Hashem makes a leaf fall from the tree to cover it. So he shouldn't be schwitzing or drying out and dying. Everyone's being directed. There's a master Hashem knowledge system that's controlling everything. But all this knowledge that Hashem has, this massive supercomputer, you would think, 1 second, Hashem has so much going on. There's trillions and trillions of things that He's following. Each one has their own, biological system of, the whole system of blood flow and energy and chemistry and digestion. Hashem is following intimately each one and His whole digestive system. You'd think Hashem is consumed with it. It's not an additional detail to God, because there is no separate area of knowledge from God's essence Himself. Hashem is aware of Himself. It's His knowledge. It's the information. It's all one. Now, because this is very difficult to picture, and it's interesting. He doesn't say here impossible. He says it's difficult. Until now, he said it's impossible, and he doesn't say to understand. He says to picture, because the truth is, we're not talking here about understanding it. Even to picture this concept is very difficult. Just to try and accept it. It's like almost, there are certain things in life we can't understand, but we accept it because we saw it happen. You see a guy jump from the floor onto a 10-story building. He jumps from the floor onto a 10-story building. It's impossible. We can't understand how that happened, but we can picture it. Why? Because while it's out of my ability to understand how a person could physically jump from the floor 100 feet onto a building, but I can picture it. Then there are things that I can't even picture. It's so complicated. Like the famous example we give, trying to picture an elephant going through the eye of a needle without the elephant changing sizes and without the needle changing sizes. I can't even picture it. If I'm not talking about understanding it, I can't even in my mind try and picture how we have an elephant that weighs 6 or 7 tons, and it's going to climb through the eye of a needle, which remains the size of an eye of a needle, and the elephant won't change size, and the needle won't change size, but Hashem could do that. No problem. We can't even picture these concepts. Forget about understanding how it works. Meaning it's a much deeper depth. It's something we can't grasp. It's like the blind man trying to understand yellow. It's not in our ability. The Al-Kain Amr HaNavi. And this is what the Navi says we say it every fast day in the Haftorah. It's just like the heavens. The highest heavens, the solar system, the top, billions of light years away. And if that itself is hard to wrap our minds around, the idea of millions of light years. If light travels at 126,000 miles a second, and we're talking about, it takes the sun to get here, like 6-7 minutes for the sunlight to get to us. We're talking about 126,000 miles a second over 1,000,000 years. That's pretty far, the end of this universe. From the end of the universe to us, just as that distance is an incredible distance that can't be imagined. Hashem says that is how I work. You cannot fathom the same, like the distance of heavens to earth is a difference from my ways to your ways, and my mind and your mind. My mind, God says, works on a whole different system, not a different operating system, a whole different system. It's not even something I can try and explain how it's different, because I don't even know enough to even say how it's different. It's just not the same as human knowledge. And it says, the prophets tell us, you think if you search, you will understand God. God is something that's not humanly possible to grasp in our minds. And the Rebbe finishes quoting the Rambam by saying, like, a person can see that which is godliness, and because Hashem's knowledge is one with Himself, while our knowledge is a separate thing. We have something called our identity. We have something called our ability to think, our intellectual capacity, and we have that which we're thinking about. 5 times 5 is 25. But by us, it's 3 separate things. There's me, This is my thinking process. God forbid somebody loses the thinking process. He's still a person. He just unfortunately can't think. But if a person's thinking process and his essence and the thing you think about I want, that's only in God's world. The interesting thing is the Rambam, the Alter Rebbe, quoting here since the bottom of page 164 to the bottom of this page, he's quoting the Rambam, and he says Ad Kan until here I'm quoting the Rambam. Well, what's interesting is he's not quoting the Rambam verbatim. He's actually quoting the Rambam and explaining the Rambam in his own words. In other words, the Alter Rebbe is telling you how to understand this Rambam, because the Rambam itself is very difficult to understand because it's a very deep philosophical idea. So the Alter Rebbe adds on commentary, and the Rebbe in a talk that he gave, I didn't know what it was, but he explains that when you're quoting a source and you're giving it some definition, it's okay to say, until here is a quote, even though you gave a definition, because if you stick accurate and true to the point being made by the author, it's not called adding on your thing, it's called elucidating, almost like if I'm reading to you a quote and I'm translating it, and I say, until here is what he said it. Hello, he didn't say it in English, he said it in Hebrew or in Aramaic. I'm translating it, and I'm just telling you. So the Alter is translating it into words that our philosophical mind could try and grasp. And then he finishes off this section of the chapter, Ayin Sham, Behilchas Yisod HaTorah. Look what he says there in the laws of the fundamentals of Torah knowledge and the fundamentals of Judaism, the Rambam, of course. And he says, V'hiskimu imoy chachmei HaKabbalah k'mavur pardis Ramak Zal. And he says the sages of Kabbalah agree with him, because not everyone agrees with the Rambam. But the Rambam says that God is the knower, is the knowledge, and is the thing being known. There are many who say, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? There's God, he knows stuff, and there's us. Hashem knows us. What do you mean we're all one? So there's a big argument amongst many philosophers. What's the Rambam saying here that's all one? On the other hand, the Kabbalists all agree. Like we have the Ramak, or Moshe Rapoport, one of the great original leaders of the Kabbalistic group in Sfas in the late 1500s, he, for an example, clearly writes that the Rambam is correct, that God and his knowledge and his wisdom and the thing he knows are all one. This is one of the famous arguments, but the Kabbalah in general goes along with the Rambam on this. This concludes this part of the chapter. I want to introduce and begin the next section now, and we'll go much more in depth next week. The next thing we're going to do, which is that little, it looks like a new chapter, a new paragraph, but there's no new number. It's just a new paragraph on the bottom of Pei Gimel, the bottom of 165. The Alter Rebbe now is going to go into what is one of the oldest and probably biggest arguments in Kabbalah. In general, in Kabbalah, unlike the Talmud, there aren't arguments. In general, in Kabbalah, there's consistency. There's a couple places where there's disagreements, but in general, it's mostly agreed. There's some philosophical differences, there's some Hasidic insights, but in general, there are not many arguments. There are a few. This next section we're going to address deals with one of the most famous and probably oldest arguments in the world of Kabbalah and the world of God's relationship to the world. It's a very important topic to try and understand as much as we can, because it plays itself out in many ways and also changes a lot of how we see God's relationship to the universe. So let me explain to you first the backstory or the backdrop for the argument and what's going on here. The question is, how did Hashem get, so to speak, from his great infinite self to us here in Mequon or wherever we are right now? How did Hashem get here to the apple? How did Hashem go from where he is to the human being, to the angels? Hashem is infinite, endless, bligvul, absolute, eternal infinity, the most infinite existence, the only true infinite existence, doesn't have a beginning, doesn't have an end, doesn't have a place where he starts and stops. There's no time, there's no place. And suddenly you have a nice, crunchy, juicy apple. Suddenly you have people who enjoy, playing tennis. Suddenly you have people that are going to be predators and hurt other people. How did this happen? So the process is, the way it's explained always, is that there was a very long process of going and diminishing and diminishing and diminishing and diminishing God's self until he can come to the place where he created something so low. Meaning it was a lessening and a lessening and a lessening of self until we come to a place where there could be something that exists as a universe, as an angel. That was a general philosophy that went on for most years. When the Arizal came along, the Arizal innovated an idea, a concept, which he explained, called Tzimtzum. Tzimtzum means, and I'm going to use an example which is absolutely wrong, but there's no right example to use. So I'm going to use the wrong example. I'll say it in advance. I'll explain to you why it's wrong. But this is the example used because there is no really good physical example to use that our minds could deal with. And this is as follows. When Hashem created the world, everywhere, everything was the essence of Hashem. The problem was, if you have the essence of Hashem, there's no room for anything else to exist. If everything is God, where could you create something else? So it says as follows. God, Tzimtzum es atzma, he contracted himself. Don't get caught up with the word contracted yet. He contracted himself and he created a clear space. Almost like, again, I'm going to use terrible examples. If I have a board and I'm a scientist and I'm writing an equation on the board and I fill up the entire blackboard, or today whiteboard, a smart board, I fill up the entire board with equations and numbers and all these equations, and there's not a space left, and I want to explain something else to somebody else who wants to know about another subject. So I'll wipe away something clear, and that clear space I can put something new in. So it says God cleared a space for himself, of himself, and in that space he injected a tiny thing called a kav. Kav means a thin line. He injected a little bit of himself into that space and began the process of creation. That is the concept of Tzimtzum, which is obviously blatantly, grossly not correct to describe this, as we'll see in a moment. Nevertheless, that's the concept to start with. He said God contracted himself. He made himself either smaller, or he made himself diminished, or he hid himself, and he made a clear space where he could start, almost like, imagine this, almost like if you went into the center of the sun, and where everything is that millions and billions, I don't know how hot the sun is, millions of degrees hot, and you want to over there bake a cake. So let's say you have the ability to clear a space where it becomes 0 degrees or a comfortable 65 degrees Fahrenheit in that space. And over there, you could take a little bit of the sunlight and use that to bake a cake. That's like what it would be like. Hashem cleared a space where we could start in that space, and that's where he created the universe. Universe here doesn't mean the solar system and all the solar systems. It means even the angels, even the heavenly spheres, even Atzilus. We're talking about where he started the process where there could be levels and layers and existence and all that. The discussion we're going to have, once we start discussing what does this mean, he contracted himself of the Arizal, we're going to find there's an argument between two theories in the Kabbalists. One vision of the Kabbalists are that this Tzimtzum, this idea of the God contracting himself, actually means literally. It was a literal contraction. I guess I'm going to explain next week. We'll go through this in depth. What does it mean literal? And the other opinion is going to say, no, it's not literal. The whole contraction is only an appearance, as how we perceive it. But in truth, it never was a contraction. There never was a concealment. There never was a clear space. And it never was anything. It was just a perception that we have as created beings, how we try and explain it. This is going to be the two tracks that we take if this Tzimtzum is literal or not literal. So now that you understand what the package coming up is going to be, let's go back, take a few moments, what we have left today, and discuss what is wrong about, what is so grossly wrong about our comment, our statement. You see, if God existed within space, then you could say God cleared a space. You can't clear a space in a place that space doesn't exist. God doesn't have a place. What do you mean he made a place without God? God is everything, everywhere. It's like saying, for an example, let's say I'm allergic to nuts. I'm not, thank God. But let's say I'm allergic to peanuts. And I come into a lunchroom and someone says, Moshe is coming into the lunchroom. Let's clear all the peanuts out of this lunchroom. Make sure there's no peanut butter here. That's something you can do. You can even take if it's a really highly allergic reaction possible, you can actually sterilize the room. You could bleach it. You can clean it out. Not a residue, especially even if they had peanut butter factory here, they can clean it completely. Not a drop left of peanuts in the room. 100% clear. Let's say I'm coming into the room and I don't like math. I hate math. I actually do. I don't like math. Imagine someone says, Moshe's coming into the room. Let's get rid of all the things that are 5 times 5. Make sure nowhere in this room is any math. No 5 times 5 in the room. 5 times 5 is not a thing that's in a room. 5 times 5 is an idea. You can't clear 5 times 5 out of a room. It doesn't exist in space. It's an idea. You can't say, okay, we took all the 5 times 5s out of the room, and now the room is clear of all 5 times 5. You can't, because 5 times 5 never was in the room and never was out of the room. It's an idea. If you talk about it, if you think about it in your head, it's 5 times 5. You don't think about it, 5 times 5 is still 25. It's not an idea that you could say we're clearing it. While you could later say that 5 times 5 exists in my head, not in my elbow, that you could say, because there is a way where it comes revealed, where 5 times 5 could come revealed into I can say it with my mouth. I can express it by showing a bunch of apples coming into 25 apples. But the concept of 5 times 5 doesn't have a place. That idea, it's called a general knowledge information, general intellectual thought. Intellectual thoughts don't have a place. They're concepts, they're ideas. You can't say, I'm clearing all the intellectual thoughts out of this area, and this half of the room only has like odd numbers, like 7s and 9s. It's not a thing that you can clear. So saying that Hashem cleared the space of himself doesn't make sense, both because there is no space by Hashem, and also because you can't clear a abstract, a spiritual thing from an area. It wasn't there in the first place to be cleared, and clearing it doesn't make it out there anymore. You can't put a fan on. Okay, I put a very high-powered fan. We blew out all the intellectual ideas. The room now is clear. You can't do that. So we're going to go and understand in this next section of the Tanya, what does it mean that Hashem contracted himself? What are the two perspectives? The perspective of those, by the way, just so you know, fascinating, a lot of the argument originally between Chabad and the the Misnagdim against the Alter Rebbe was this thing, because Chabad takes the perspective that Tzimtzum is not Kipshatoi. Tzimtzum didn't really happen. The contraction never happened. It's a concept that we perceive. And the others say, no, Tzimtzum actually happened. It happened, and there's a disconnect. What was their theory, by the way, of saying there's a disconnect? Just understand why they want to say it's an actual disconnect from a place. It's based on a perspective, and it's a very good perspective. Imagine I'm the CEO of a company, or someone's the CEO of a company. The company's worth millions of dollars, and I sit there and I'm in the office, and there's a room where all the garbage is kept from all the dumpsters, and the dumpster garbage is being arranged. I don't get involved with that. I don't have a connection. The CEO of the company doesn't walk into that room and say, okay, let's clear the garbage. It's a disrespect to him to say that he goes into that room or that he cares about that room. I have nothing to do with that room. The garbage, the dumpsters, it smells, it's full of bugs, it's critters there, it's a horrible odor. The king doesn't go there. The CEO doesn't go there. To say that Hashem is involved in the physical world is an insult. The world is a place of imperfections, piece of flesh and people of flesh and blood that pass away and decay. There are people that do evil, people that sin, people that lie, people that are selfish. God does not invest himself in this area physically, personally. He has to be a disconnect. Whereas the philosophers or the Kabbalists on the other side said, what are you kidding me? You think God clears the space from himself? We can't see God. It's not clear to us. And we're going to see next week, I'm going to go into trying to explain the best of my ability, these two perspectives of Tzimtzum, whether it's actual or it never happened. And these ideas are actually much easier to understand now once we've did the first 6.5 chapters of Tanya, because now there's ideas that we can relate to, talking about possibilities of God's awareness of us at the same time, not awareness, awareness of us at the same time. We don't have an independent existence. That is not a contradiction. Maybe we can't understand how it works, but it's not a contradiction because we do exist in God's mind and knowledge, which is to us actual tables, chairs, apples, and oranges, etc. At the same time, nothing exists outside of God. As we'll see as we go into these two ideas, it's a fascinating way to try and understand Hashem's creation of the world. Obviously, if you believe solely in the Big Bang Theory, you're going to have trouble with this area coming up. But if you want to know, how did Hashem create the world? How did it work? What did he do? How was the process? We're talking about the first instant, the first split second of beginning. How did it start? There has to be a starting point. That's what we're going to discuss next week. Tzimtzum, what does this mean, this contraction? And hopefully we'll do an enjoyable, good discussion.